2002 saw the release of The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers for the PlayStation 2 and original Xbox. It was one of EA's massive AAA releases of the year, and riding on the hype of the Peter Jackson film trilogy at the time, was met with lots of excitement from both the gaming press and the public alike. Surprisingly, The Two Towers was a far better game than your typical movie tie-in of the time. Well, not a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, it was playable, which was more than could be said about other licensed games of its ilk, though the headlining feature of the game had nothing to do with the passable gameplay. EA instead focused its marketing on the innovative visuals on display in the title. The Two Towers narrative relied heavily on using cinematics ripped straight out of the aforementioned Jackson film trilogy to tell its story. The game would then seamlessly shift from film frames to real-time graphics as the cutscene ended and gameplay began. The visual fidelity needed to accomplish this trick was almost unheard of at the time, and the feature was widely heralded as a result. Of course, this was 19 years ago. If we look at the effect today, it's laughably lackluster. 2002 also saw the release of another fantasy game, but one cut from a completely different cloth. This title was less of a hack and slash and more of an adventure role-playing game, and while similarly a AAA release, its visual language was entirely different in nature. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, despite being a divisive release at the time due to the massive departure of its visual language, serves as a fantastic contrast when compared with The Two Towers as to how art direction affects the perception of your game over time, and a poster child for the argument that game devs should prioritize art direction over raw poly count. Chasing visual fidelity is a fine endeavor, and I don't knock professionals or hobbyists who pursue it. From a marketing perspective, it makes a lot of sense too. Gaming hardware is sold almost entirely on flashy, impressive graphics, and realism is a simple benchmark that anyone can instantly understand, since we all share an identical frame of reference for what the goal is. Showing how much more real a game looks than the previous installment, or compared to what was possible on older hardware, immediately leaves a clear and concise impression of better. But there's a flip side to this. When you create a product devoid of any visual identity other than make it as real as possible, you also build a self-destruct timer into your game. Benchmarks, visual or otherwise, by definition have a limited shelf life. While a technical flex can move unit sales at the beginning of a game's life, when the bar is inevitably raised by technology continuing to improve, that wow factor disappears, and what you're left with is nothing more than a snapshot of the technical constraints of the time. One only has to return to The Two Towers for proof of this. While a jaw-dropping graphical showstopper in its day, when considered by current standards, the visuals in The Two Towers are outclassed by free games that you can download on your iPhone, and the gap is only going to become more jarring the further we move away from the game's release. This fact inevitably cheapens the appeal of the game's presentation, and betrays the work that went into creating it. All the time, effort, and ingenuity required to push those levels of visuals out of anemic hardware like the PlayStation 2 are lost on modern audiences. All that's left on display in the visual presentation of The Two Towers is what it lacks. Conversely, even today The Wind Waker dazzles because the stars of the show aren't the polygons on screen, but the vision behind how they were assembled. By putting art direction first, The Wind Waker transcends its technical constraints and, for the most part, becomes a timeless aesthetic that ages gracefully. A cartoon is by its very nature a simplification, and by changing the art direction of the game to something that could largely be accomplished instead of merely approximated, The Wind Waker creates its own bar to clear and then does so definitively. Sure, pixel peepers can still scrutinize the game on a technical level and point out the fact that Link's legs are barely more than octagons, but these limitations are downplayed by the art direction, not brought to the forefront. By choosing to take the riskier path and detaching itself from the realism arms race that pervades the majority of AAA development, almost paradoxically, The Wind Waker gives itself a shelf life that will easily last another 20 years and then some. All I'm suggesting here is that perhaps there's a lesson worth taking to heart.